48 shells. That was the entire combat record of the largest gun ever built. It weighed 1,300 tons. It rode on 2 railway tracks laid side by side because no single track could bear its weight. It took 2,500 men to operate, 3 weeks to assemble, and it threw a shell as heavy as a loaded truck across nearly 30 miles of open country. It was designed to break the strongest forts in the world. By the time it was finished, the forts it had been built to break had already fallen to other means. The men who built it were not generals, they were not state engineers, and they were not arms designers by blood. They were merchants. 4 centuries earlier, the family had sold groceries, wine, and property in a small German town, and staked everything on a single idea, that they could make a kind of steel the English insisted only the English could make. From that one bet came the guns that won a war in 1870, the siege mortars that opened the first battles of 1914, and a shell fuse so widely licensed that British artillery firing on German soldiers still owed a royalty to a factory in Essen. The empire passed to a girl of 16, and the Kaiser himself chose her husband. It was preserved intact for a single heir by a decree signed in person by Adolf Hitler. Its owner was convicted of slave labor and stripped of everything he owned, and had all of it handed back to him 3 years later. This is the story of how one family's steelworks armed Germany through a monarchy, a republic, and a dictatorship. Who made the decisions, and what every one of those decisions actually cost. Chapter 1. The steel the English owned. In 1811, the best steel in the world came from one city, and that city intended to keep it. Sheffield, in England, held the process for crucible cast steel melted in sealed clay pots until it ran fully liquid and poured uniform, without the hidden slag and flaws that split cheaper metal under load. It was the material that precision ran on. Springs, cutting tools, dies, the moving parts of the new machine age all needed steel that would not fail unpredictably, and cast steel was the only steel that could promise it. The technique was about 70 years old, worked out by a clockmaker named Benjamin Huntsman around 1740, and the men who owned it treated it as a state secret. They did not publish the method. They did not license it. They did not sell it at any price. A buyer anywhere on the European continent who wanted true cast steel bought the finished bar from England, in England's quantities, at England's price, and had no way to make his own. That gap between what England could do and what everyone else could not was an enormous standing opportunity. It was also a wall that had held for 2 generations. The man who decided to go through the wall was named Friedrich Krupp, and he was not a steelmaker. He was the heir to a merchant house, and the house was old. The Krupps had been in the town of Essen since 1587, when a trader named Arndt Krupp arrived and joined the Merchants' Guild. Arndt built the family fortune the way fortunes were often built in that century, by holding cash when others were desperate for it. When plague swept the district in the 1590s and families fled, he bought the property they abandoned, cheaply, and kept it. By his death in 1624, he was among the richest men in Essen. For the 2 centuries that followed, his descendants were what he had been: dealers in wine, in groceries, in land, in money, and at least one of them dabbled in gunsmithing, a small early thread connecting the name to weapons long before anyone thought of cannon. Late in the 18th century, a formidable widow named Helene Amelie Krupp pushed the family toward metal, running a trading operation and acquiring an ironworks, the Good Hope Foundry, around 1800. When she died in 1810, she left almost the whole of the Krupp fortune to a single grandson. It is worth sitting with the length of that run, because it is the foundation of everything that follows, and it is easy to underestimate. By the time Friedrich lit his first furnace, the Krupps had already been a fixture of Essen for more than 200 years. They had lived through the 30 Years' War, through plagues and famines and the rise and fall of the small states around them, and they had done it by being merchants rather than makers, holders of cash and property and trading contracts, rather than builders of anything in particular. There is even an early thread of the family touching weapons, an ancestor who worked as a gunsmith in the 17th century, a small foreshadowing of a name that would one day be synonymous with cannon, though nothing at the time suggested it. What the family had, above all, was staying power and capital, the patience to hold assets across generations, and the reserves to survive the years that ruined others. That is the deep asset Friedrich inherited, not a factory and not a skill, but a fortune, and a name with 2 centuries of standing behind it. And it is exactly what he spent. The significance is this. The Krupp story does not begin with steel, and it does not begin with guns. It begins with a merchant family that had already proven, over roughly 200 years, that it knew how to survive, and then produced, in Friedrich, the first member willing to risk the whole accumulated inheritance on a single industrial idea. Everything afterward, the guns and the empire and the crimes and the foundation that survives today, grows out of that one pivot, the moment a house of traders decided to become a house of makers, and staked 400 years of caution on it. That grandson was Friedrich, and Friedrich had an idea that had nothing to do with groceries. On the 20th of November, 1811, Friedrich Krupp and two partners founded a works in Essen for one stated purpose, written into the founding document, to manufacture English cast steel and the articles made from it. The word English was in the charter. The whole venture was an attack on a monopoly, a plan to reverse engineer what Sheffield hid and sell the result across a continent with no source of its own. It was not an unreasonable ambition, it was simply an expensive one, because the recipe was genuinely hard, and Friedrich did not have it. Making cast steel was not a matter of will. It was a matter of temperatures, clay, ore, and timing that the English had spent 70 years perfecting and had told no one. For years, the furnaces at Essen produced steel that was almost right and therefore worthless, because a spring or a die made from almost right steel fails, and a customer who is burned once does not return. The partners saw where it was heading and left. Friedrich carried the costs alone, and the costs did not stop. Around 1816, he finally produced cast steel good enough to sell, and turned out tanner's tools, dies for stamping coins, and coin blanks for the mints of small German states. It was real product at last. It was not enough product. The plant swallowed money faster than the goods returned it, and Friedrich borrowed to bridge the gap, and then borrowed against the borrowing, in the oldest and most fatal sequence in business. He spent his inheritance, and then he spent beyond it. On the 8th of October, 1826, Friedrich Krupp died in Essen at the age of 39. He left a works that barely functioned, a debt of roughly 10,000 thalers, and a payroll shrunk to a handful of men whose wages were already weeks behind. There was a specific reason the timing had looked so promising, and it is worth understanding, because it explains why an intelligent man bet a fortune on a process he did not have. When Friedrich founded the works in 1811, Napoleon's continental system was choking English goods off the European mainland, and for a few years a continental maker of cast steel would have faced no English competition at all because English steel could not legally reach the market. On paper, it was the perfect moment to break in, a monopoly held shut from the outside by a blockade. The trouble was that Friedrich could not actually make the steel while the window was open. By the time his furnaces produced anything worth selling, around 1816, Napoleon had fallen, and the English bars were flowing back across the Rhine, cheaper and more reliable than anything Essen could pour. He had built for an opening that closed before he was ready to walk through it. Worse, a man hunting a guarded secret is an easy mark, and accounts of his life describe him paying for the method more than once, handing money to men who claimed to know how the English did it, and delivered nothing usable. Every dead end cost capital the estate did not have to spare, and the estate had begun large. Friedrich had inherited one of the substantial merchant fortunes of Essen, and across 15 years he converted most of it into a debt of 10,000 thalers and a furnace that half worked. That is the precise anatomy of the failure. He did not aim too low. He aimed at the single hardest target in European industry, funded it with a family fortune, tied it to a war he did not control, and ran out of money and time a few years before the process would finally have come good in his son's hands. He also left an heir. The man who had tried to break the richest monopoly in Europe handed the unfinished attempt, underwater and half-built, to his son. The son was 14 years old. That was not a promising inheritance. It was a debt with a furnace attached, and the reasonable thing to do with it was to sell the scrap and walk away. The boy did not do the reasonable thing. Chapter 2. The Boy with 7 Men. Alfred Krupp was born on the 26th of April, 1812, and he left school at 14 because his father had died and there was no one else. In 1826, the payroll he inherited was somewhere between 5 and 7 men, depending on which account is counted, and the cast steel process his father had chased for 15 years still did not reliably work. There was no visible reason the business should survive. Most businesses in that condition do not. What Alfred had, instead of capital, was a refusal to let the thing die, and a very specific idea about where the value actually sat. He kept the works alive by narrowing it. He stopped reaching for the grand, unreliable prize, and sold what the furnaces could actually make, well, precision rolls and small tools of cast steel, to customers who needed hard, uniform metal and could not easily buy it elsewhere. In 1830, he delivered his first cast steel rolls to a customer in Hagen, and rolls for shaping metals and minting became the early cash that kept the lights on. He worked the crucibles with his own hands, and he became notorious for a secrecy that bordered on illness. He guarded the process his father had died reaching for, as if every visitor were a spy sent from Sheffield, because, in his judgment, every visitor might be. That secrecy was not a quirk of temperament, it was the entire asset. The company was worth precisely the difference between what it knew and what its competitors knew, and Alfred meant to keep that difference at any cost, even the cost of trusting no one. Then the market shifted in his favor. In 1834, the German customs union, the Zollverein, tore down the internal tariffs that had walled the German states off from one another and turned a patchwork of tiny markets into one large one. Demand for good steel climbed. The workforce that had been 5 or 7 men grew to 60 or 70 by the end of that single year, and by 1850 it stood at around 240. The narrow, paranoid tool and roll shop had become a genuine factory, and it had grown on the strength of quality rather than price, which set the template for everything the firm would ever sell. Krupp would never be the cheap option. It would be the one that did not fail. But the product that actually made Krupp rich was not a weapon, and it was not a tool. It was a wheel. Railways were spreading across Europe and America at a speed that outran every supplier, and a railway's most dangerous single part was the tire, the steel ring fitted around each wheel where metal met rail. Tires were forged and then welded into a hoop, and the weld was a flaw lying in wait. A tire that failed at speed threw a train off the track and killed people. Alfred worked out how to forge a railway tire with no weld at all, a single seamless ring of cast steel, and he patented it in Prussia in 1853. It was safer than anything else available, and the market for it was every railway on Earth. Orders came from across the continent and from the United States, which became one of his largest customers, and the seamless tire, not the cannon, became the foundation of the Krupp fortune. The man built his empire selling the safest wheel in the world. He turned that wheel into the company's face. On the 9th of December, 1875, Krupp registered a trademark with the district court in Essen, 3 rings overlapping in a row. For a century and a half, onlookers have assumed the 3 rings are chain links, heavy industrial symbols chosen to look formidable. They are not chain links. They are 3 seamless railway tires, seen edge-on and stacked, the peaceful safety product that built the firm, promoted to its emblem. Before the First World War, that mark of 3 train wheels would be registered in 56 countries. It would eventually be stamped on the barrels of the guns of 2 world wars. And it would still, today, sit on the letterhead of what the company has since become. Remember the wheels. They keep coming back. And they never once stop meaning what they meant at the start, which is a thing built to move people safely, sold by a family that would spend the next century building things designed to do the opposite. The way he protected the tire business is the clearest window into how his mind worked. Alfred patented the seamless tire itself, because a physical product sold in the open can be reverse-engineered and must be defended in law. But the smelting process that made his steel superior in the first place, the thing his father had died chasing, he refused to patent at all, and the refusal was deliberate. To patent a process is to publish it, to hand a written description to the world in exchange for a term of protection that eventually expires. Alfred wanted no term and no description. He kept the method as an unwritten trade secret, taught by hand to a small number of trusted men and committed to paper as little as possible, so that there was nothing to expire and nothing to copy. His whole strategy was to make the company's core knowledge inseparable from the loyalty of the specific men who held it, which is exactly why, a few years later, he would spend so much money making sure those men never had a reason to leave. The market rewarded the approach. The seamless tire found buyers on every railway that could afford the best, and the United States in particular became an enormous customer as its rail network exploded across a continent. The workforce that had stood at around 240 in 1850 kept climbing through the 1860s toward the thousands, and Krupp steel moved from a regional curiosity to a global brand carried on the wheels of trains across 2 hemispheres. Alfred had also begun, quietly, to build the other thing his strategy required, a company town, laying the first foundations of the housing and welfare system that would eventually bind tens of thousands of workers to the firm. By the middle of the century, Alfred had done what his father could not. He had a working process, a protected product, a market that spanned 2 continents, and a workforce in the hundreds. He had built a steel company on wheels and tools. What he did next was decide that a steel company should also make cannon, and he took that decision to a government that told him, for 12 straight years, that it was not interested. Chapter 3. The answer was bronze. For most of the 19th century, a field gun was made of bronze, and there were good reasons for it. Bronze was old and understood. Foundries had been casting it for centuries. Its behavior held no surprises, and, most important, it failed gracefully. Under the shock of firing, bronze flexed a little instead of shattering, and when it finally wore out, it did so slowly and visibly, giving a crew warning before it gave out. Steel was the opposite in every one of those respects. Steel was harder and could be made stronger. But a harder metal carrying a hidden flaw does not bend when it reaches its limit. It bursts. A steel gun that burst did not wear out. It killed the men standing around it. Every artillery officer in Europe understood this, and so every artillery officer in Europe gave the same answer when a steelmaker arrived selling cannon. The answer was bronze. Alfred Krupp cast his first steel cannon in 1847, a small 3-pounder machined from a solid steel blank. Prussia had shown a flicker of interest even earlier, commissioning an experimental 1-ton cast steel gun in 1844, but the flicker did not become orders. Alfred's problem was not that his guns were poor. His problem was that he was asking career officers to gamble their crew's lives on a metal famous for exploding in order to replace a metal that worked at a higher price. Their refusal was not stupidity, it was arithmetic. Bronze was proven, bronze was cheaper to found, and the state had already sunk decades of money, training, and doctrine into bronze guns and the men who made them. For steel to be worth throwing all of that away, it could not be a little better. It had to be overwhelmingly, undeniably better, and Alfred could not prove that in a country that would not even test it. So he did the only thing left to a man locked out of his home market. He advertised, on a scale no one had attempted. In 1851, at the Great Exhibition in London, beneath the glass of the Crystal Palace, Krupp set down a flawless cast steel ingot of roughly 2 tons, larger and cleaner than anything his rivals could pour without cracking, and beside it a polished 6-pounder cannon of solid cast steel. It stopped the crowds. Without a word of argument, it announced that this firm in Essen could make steel bigger and purer than anyone alive. In 1855, at the Paris Exposition, he escalated the argument to the point of absurdity and displayed a single steel ingot weighing 100,000 pounds, some 45 tons. A slab that served no function whatsoever except to prove that Krupp could make it and no one else could. Alfred was selling the capability years before he could sell the product, manufacturing a reputation loud enough to carry through a wall of official contempt. He understood something his competitors did not, that when a buyer will not evaluate the goods on their merits, the seller must first make it impossible to ignore the name. The strategy behind the spectacle was colder than it looked. Alfred could not run a firing trial for a Prussian officer who would not schedule one, so he turned the great public expositions into his proving ground and let the crowd apply the pressure the army would not. An ingot of 45 tons had no customer and no purpose as a product. As an advertisement, it was priceless, because it forced every rival steelmaker and every military attaché walking the halls to concede, silently and in public, that Krupp could do what they could not. He was selling the ceiling of his capability rather than any particular gun, and he was doing it in the one venue where reputation could not be quietly refused. There is a further piece of arithmetic worth stating, because it is the heart of why the rejection was rational rather than foolish. A state that switched from bronze to steel was not just buying new guns. It was writing off its existing foundries, retraining its gun founders, rebuilding its doctrine, and betting the lives of its crews on the new metal's reliability, all at once and all up front, against a future war that might never come. The cost of switching was enormous and immediate. The benefit was uncertain and deferred. Any finance officer would have done the same sum and reached the same answer, which was to wait, and let some other nation prove the metal first. Alfred's entire foreign strategy was built on finding the states desperate enough, or ambitious enough, to be that first mover. The buyers came, but the wrong ones first, exactly as the arithmetic predicted. Egypt bought Krupp guns in 1856. Belgium bought in 1861. Russia bought in 1863. The Cannon King's earliest artillery customers were foreign states, because his own government still preferred bronze and would not be moved. And then the wall finally cracked from the inside. In 1859, the Prince Regent of Prussia, the future Kaiser Wilhelm I, ordered 312 steel cannon from Essen. It was the order Alfred had chased for 12 years, and it arrived only after much of the rest of the world had already validated him. The proof he had been forced to sell abroad had at last been sold back home. Prussia now had steel guns. France, its most likely enemy, still had bronze ones. In 1870, the two would meet, and the question that 12 years of official skepticism had refused to test would be answered in a single season, at the muzzle. Chapter 4. The Arsenal of the Reich. The Franco-Prussian War began in the summer of 1870, and it settled the argument about metal in a matter of weeks. Krupp's steel breech-loading field guns loaded from the rear, which made them faster to fire, and they reached farther than the French bronze muzzle loaders they faced. French crews had to load from the front, a slower and more exposed motion, and their guns could not answer the Prussian batteries at the ranges the Prussians chose to fight from. The result was not close. On the 1st of September, 1870, at Sedan, Krupp gunfire helped suppress the French artillery and seal an encirclement in which more than 100,000 French soldiers surrendered, and the Emperor Napoleon III himself was taken prisoner. In January of 1871, heavy Krupp pieces, including 21-centimeter siege mortars, shelled Paris until the city gave in. A German empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and the firm that had built its winning artillery earned a title it would carry for the next 50 years, the Arsenal of the Reich. What that victory did to Krupp's standing is hard to overstate, and it converted a commercial success into something closer to a national institution. Before 1870, the argument about steel had been an engineers' dispute, conducted in proving grounds and procurement offices. After 1870, it had been settled on a battlefield in front of the whole world, and the verdict was public and total. Krupp steel had beaten French bronze in the decisive war of the age, and every army that intended to survive the next war now had to reckon with the metal Alfred had spent 20 years failing to sell. Orders that skepticism had blocked for a decade now came looking for him. The relationship with the Prussian crown, soon the German imperial crown, deepened into the patronage that would define the firm for 2 generations, and the nickname that had followed Alfred as a half-mocking label, the Cannon King, hardened into a plain description of fact. He was, by any measure that counted, the most important arms manufacturer in the world, and he had reached that position by refusing to accept that his home market's rejection was the end of the argument. The lesson embedded in it is one the firm would rely on again and again. A product the state does not want in peacetime becomes the product the state cannot live without the moment a war proves it, and the maker who survived the years of rejection is the one standing ready to collect when the proof finally arrives. That could have been the ceiling of the ambition, a trusted national supplier to a single grateful state. Alfred had a much larger idea. He would sell to everyone, friend and rival alike, and he would build the machinery to do it in the open. In 1878, he opened an immense proving ground at Meppen, and there he staged an event with no real precedent, the Völkerschießen, the shooting of the nations. He invited the military purchasing agents of foreign governments to come and watch guns fired at targets, his own guns among the competitors, and to place their orders on the spot. It was an international arms fair decades before the phrase existed, a trade show where the merchandise was artillery and the customers were sovereign states shopping for the means to fight one another. It worked. By the time Alfred died, Krupp had sold artillery to 46 nations. The numbers underneath that reach are exact, and they are the reframe of the entire enterprise. Across his lifetime, Alfred Krupp produced 24,576 guns. 10,666 of them went to the German government. 13,910 went for export. More than half of every cannon the arsenal of the Reich ever made was sold to a foreign power. Some of those powers were allies of Germany. Some were not, and some would one day aim Krupp guns back at German soldiers. That was not a betrayal of the business model. That was the business model, stated plainly. A weapon sells best to whoever is most frightened, and fear does not respect a border or keep faith with a flag. Hold that idea in view. 40 years from now, it comes back as a single English shilling, stamped on a shell fired at the men who owned the patent. By 1876, armaments made up 56% of the company's turnover. The firm built on railway wheels now earned the majority of its money from guns, and it earned it globally. The strategy nearly destroyed him once. Alfred expanded aggressively, buying coal mines and ore fields to control his own supply chain from the ground up. And when the financial panic of 1873 struck, he was overextended and short of cash, exactly as his father had been on a smaller scale. He survived only by taking a 30 million mark loan arranged through a consortium tied to the Prussian State Bank. The Cannon King came within one credit line of following his father into bankruptcy. He did not, and the near miss burned a lesson into the company that it would carry for a century, that scale is a bet financed with borrowed money, and that debt, once invited in, becomes a permanent character in the story who is never again asked to leave. It is worth pausing on what selling to 46 nations actually required as a business, because it was not simply a matter of taking orders. Alfred had to build an international sales apparatus at a time when arms were still mostly bought from national foundries by national armies, and he had to price and finance deals across dozens of currencies and credit risks. He sold to Russia, which would face German guns within Alfred's own lifetime and beyond it. He sold across the Balkans and the Ottoman lands and into Asia and South America. The Meppen Proving Ground was the physical center of this machine. 40 square miles of range where a Turkish colonel and a Romanian minister and a Chinese purchasing agent could stand side by side and watch the same gun defeat the same target, and then bid against one another for it. This was the deliberate manufacture of an arms race as a revenue stream, each sale to one nation becoming the argument for a sale to its neighbor. And it carried the structural danger that would define the firm forever after. A company that earns the majority of its money from weapons is a company whose fortunes rise with the likelihood of war and fall with peace, a business with an interest, however unspoken, in the very thing that destroys its customers. Alfred never said it in those terms. His ledgers said it for him. By 1876, more than half the company's turnover came from armaments, and the near collapse of 1873 had shown how much debt sat underneath that turnover, which meant the firm now needed the arms trade not merely to grow, but to survive. There was one thing more that Alfred understood and his rivals did not. A company whose whole value is a guarded secret depends, in the end, on the men who hold the secret in their hands and their heads. Those men could leave. They could talk. They could organize and demand a larger share of what they made. Alfred decided they would do none of these things, and rather than trust to wages, he built an entire system to guarantee it, a system that looked like generosity and functioned like a fence. Chapter 5. A House Over the Stables. Between 1870 and 1873, while his guns were deciding a war, Alfred Krupp built a house. It stood on a hill above the Ruhr Valley, and it was called Villa Hügel, the villa on the hill. It had 269 rooms and roughly 87,000 square feet of floor, set in a private park of 28 hectares, nearly 70 acres, and during its construction, as many as 800 workers labored on the site. It was less a home than a statement cast in stone, and the choice of stone was itself revealing. Alfred was terrified of fire, and so wherever he could, he banned wooden beams and paneling and built with masonry and his own steel instead. He was also convinced that stale air and drafts bred disease, and had the windows built to keep them out. According to the accounts that trace back to his biographers, he positioned his private study directly above the stables, with vents in the floor, so that the smell of horse manure would rise into the room. He believed it cleared his head and stimulated his imagination. Whether or not that particular detail can be fully confirmed, it fits the man exactly, because Alfred Krupp controlled his surroundings the way he controlled his crucibles, completely and on purpose. He applied the same instinct to the men who worked for him, and there the design was a business strategy wearing the clothes of benevolence. Long before most industrialists gave it a thought, Krupp built a welfare state in miniature. There was a sickness and burial fund for workers as early as 1836. There was a pension fund for the aged and the injured by the late 1850s. From the early 1860s, the company built housing for its workforce, ran cooperative stores where a man could buy food and goods below market price, and operated a boarding house that fed first hundreds and eventually 1,000 men. A Krupp worker could be born in a Krupp house, treated in a Krupp clinic, schooled in a Krupp school, fed from a Krupp kitchen, and buried by a Krupp fund. It looked like extraordinary generosity, and in part it genuinely was. It was also a cage with very comfortable bars. In 1872, Alfred wrote the logic down and made it law inside his gates, in a document he called the General Regulative, the General Regulations, a written constitution for the firm and everyone in it. It demanded, in its own words, morality allied with order and loyalty. It urged workers to marry, to stay home with their families, and to keep out of taverns and politics. And it forbade them, on pain of dismissal, from joining a union, taking part in political activity, or entertaining socialist ideas. The welfare and the prohibition were not two policies. They were one. Alfred gave his men everything a life required, and in exchange required that they want nothing he had not chosen to give them. In 1877, he put it to his employees without decoration, warning that a man does not nourish a snake in his own bosom, and that anyone who would not give the firm his wholehearted devotion had better move along, and quickly. The housing and the pensions were the reward for that devotion. They were also precisely what a man stood to lose the day he organized against the company. That was not charity. It was control, under a kinder name, and it manufactured two generations of workers who identified with the firm more deeply than with their own class or their own interests. It is worth marking the shape of that idea now, total authority over labor, presented as care, because 60 years on, under a later Krupp and a regime with no scruples at all, the same appetite for total control over labor would arrive somewhere the soft walls did not reach. The scale of the system is worth laying out, because it was one of the largest private welfare operations in the world, and it was engineered, not improvised. The sickness and burial fund dated to the 1830s. The pension arrangements for the aged and injured came in the 1850s. From the early 1860s, the firm built entire residential colonies for its workers, thousands of dwellings eventually, laid out around the works, alongside the cooperative stores that sold food below market price and the great boarding house that fed the unmarried men. A Krupp employee could pass his whole life inside the company's provision, from the schoolroom to the grave, and tens of thousands did. And every piece of it was conditional. The General Regulative of 1872 spelled out the terms in writing. A private legal code governing the conduct of the workforce, rewarding order, marriage, sobriety, and above all loyalty, and punishing with dismissal any man who joined a union, dabbled in politics, or brought socialist ideas through the gate. Dismissal did not only mean losing a wage, it meant losing the house, the pension, the store, the school, the entire scaffold a family's life was built on. That was the genius and the menace of the design at once. Alfred had made the cost of disloyalty so total that few could afford to test it, and he had done it while being celebrated across Europe as a model of enlightened employment. The judgment a business analyst has to render is that both readings are true simultaneously. It was real welfare, and it was a mechanism of control, and it was the second precisely because it was the first. The workers who received the most were the workers who could least afford to resist, and Alfred understood that better than any labor organizer of his century. He had turned generosity into offense, and taught 2 generations to be grateful for it. On the 14th of July, 1887, Alfred Krupp died at Villa Hügel at the age of 75. He had inherited a bankrupt forge with a handful of men and a debt of 10,000 thalers. He left behind the largest private company in Germany, employing on the order of 75,000 people across its works and mines, a firm that had armed 46 nations and built a company town around its own furnaces. The Cannon King was gone, and everything he had assembled now passed to his only son. His only son had exactly 1 child of his own. After 3 generations of single male heirs, the whole enormous inheritance was about to funnel through a very narrow gate, and then through one narrower still. Chapter 6. The Girl Who Inherited an Empire. Friedrich Alfred Krupp, called Fritz, took over the firm in 1887, and he was a different animal from his father. Where Alfred had been a furnace-obsessed autocrat who trusted no one, Fritz was a scientific and political man, a member of the German Reichstag from 1893 to 1898, comfortable in drawing rooms and interested in new technologies for their own sake. Under him, the company turned decisively toward the sea. In 1896, he acquired the Germaniawerft shipyard at Kiel, which built warships, submarines, and marine engines, and with it, Krupp entered naval construction at scale. And a few years earlier, in 1893, the firm had introduced a product that would armor the navies of the world, a hardened steel plate known simply as Krupp armor. It was so much more effective than what came before it that roughly 10 inches of Krupp armor gave the same protection as 12 inches of the older American plate, a saving of weight that mattered on the deck of every battleship afloat. Krupp armor became the international standard, licensed to other nations, and improved into an even tougher grade in the years that followed. Fritz had taken his father's guns and added the steel that stopped guns. The firm now sold the sword and the shield at once, and collected on both. Then, in the autumn of 1902, it came apart in a week. Fritz had spent months each year on the island of Capri, and on the 15th of November, 1902, a social democratic newspaper published allegations about his private conduct there. 1 week later, on the 22nd of November, Fritz Krupp was dead. Whether he died by his own hand or of a stroke has never been established, and reputable sources still disagree. The company gave its account, the newspapers gave theirs, and the truth went into the ground with him. What is not in dispute is the situation his death produced. The largest company in Europe suddenly had no adult heir at all. It had a single heir, and she was 16 years old and a girl. Her name was Bertha Krupp, and in 1902 she inherited the entire firm as its sole owner. This did not sit well with the men who governed Imperial Germany, and one of them decided to correct it personally. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who regarded Krupp as an instrument of the state as much as a private business, took the flat position that the empire's most important armory could not be headed by a woman, and he inserted himself directly into the question of whom she would marry. The search settled on a career diplomat named Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach, born in The Hague in 1870, a correct, disciplined, cautious man with no background in steel and no obvious qualification for it beyond suitability. In October of 1906, Bertha married him, and at the wedding the Kaiser rose and announced that Gustav would be permitted to attach the Krupp name to his own. By imperial grant, the diplomat became Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach. The most valuable name in German industry was not inherited in the ordinary way and not earned. It was awarded, like a medal, by an emperor who treated the company as a national possession and its teenage owner as a piece to be positioned on the board. The naval turn under Fritz deserves its own accounting because it doubled the business and tied it even more tightly to the state. Krupp armor was not simply a good product. It was a licensed standard, adopted by navy after navy, which meant that when the great powers raced to build steel battleships in the years before 1914, a share of the value of that armor plate flowed back toward Essen through the license, whoever built the ship. Krupp had found the rarest position in industry, a firm that profits from an arms race on all sides of it at once, selling the guns to some, the armor to others, and the license to nearly everyone. The Germaniawerft shipyard, bought in 1896, added warships, engines, and eventually submarines to the catalog, so that by the turn of the century, the company could arm a nation on land and at sea and sell the means to defend against both. That was the empire the 16-year-old inherited, and it is why the scandal that killed her father was treated as a matter of state rather than a family tragedy. When a social democratic newspaper attacked Fritz in November of 1902, it was attacking the man who ran the most important arms firm in the Reich, and the collision of the socialist press with the emperor's favorite industrialist was political to its core. Fritz was dead within a week, by his own hand or by a stroke, and the question was never settled because too many powerful interests preferred it unsettled. What the affair left behind was a governance crisis with no precedent. The largest company in Europe owned outright by a teenage girl in an age and a country that would not permit a woman to run it. The Kaiser's solution, to choose her husband and graft the family name onto him, was not sentimental. It was a corporate succession managed by the head of state, because the state regarded the succession as its own affair. So the firm passed into the hands of a man who had married into it and been renamed by decree, at the pleasure of a monarch who fully intended to use what that firm could build. Within 8 years, the Kaiser would have his war, and the borrowed name he had pinned on a diplomat at a wedding party would be painted on the barrels of the guns that opened it. The largest of those guns would be named after the bride. Chapter 7. Big Bertha. Kaiser Wilhelm II was a frequent guest at Villa Hügel, and the relationship between the crown and the company was as intimate as a business relationship can be without formally becoming one. The Kaiser regarded Krupp as the armory of his empire, and Gustav Krupp, the imported diplomat now running it, managed the firm as an extension of the state's ambitions. By 1914, Krupp held what amounted to a monopoly over German arms manufacture and employed around 81,000 people. When the war came in August of that year, the company was ready with a weapon designed for the exact problem the German army was about to meet: the modern fortress. Belgium and France had ringed their frontiers with forts of reinforced concrete and armored steel, built to stop an advancing army cold and hold it while the defenders mobilized. Krupp had built a howitzer to break them. Officially, it was the 42-centimeter Mgaret. Its caliber was 420 millimeters, 16.5 inches, a bore wide enough to pass a man's shoulders through. Emplaced and ready to fire, it weighed close to 43 tons. It threw a shell up to 1.5 meters long and as heavy as 1,160 kilograms out to a range of about 9,000 meters, at a rate of roughly 8 rounds an hour, each shell descending almost vertically to punch through fortress roofs never designed to take that kind of blow from above. Krupp built 12 of them. On the 12th of August, 1914, one opened fire on Fort de Pontis, guarding the city of Liège, and the fort surrendered after 2 days under it. On the 15th of August, at Fort de Lanson, a shell found the magazine, and that fort did not surrender. It detonated from the inside and ceased to exist, taking much of its garrison with it. The soldiers who served the guns gave them a name, and the name is where a thread planted 8 years earlier is paid in full. They called it Dicke Bertha, Big Bertha, after Bertha Krupp, the woman who owned the company that built it. The girl the Kaiser had married off in 1906 on the grounds that an armory could not be headed by a woman now had the empire's most feared siege weapon named in her honor by the men who fired it. Her name on the barrel was intended as a tribute, and it was received as one. Hold on to it. The name has one more appearance to make, 30 years on, and in a place where no one will mistake it for an honor. The firm built one weapon in that war, stranger even than Big Bertha. In 1918, Krupp produced the Paris gun, a cannon designed not to break forts but to break morale, by striking a city that believed itself out of reach. Its barrel was 37 meters long. It fired a shell of about 106 kilograms at a muzzle velocity of 1,640 meters per second, and that shell climbed to an altitude of roughly 42 kilometers, into the stratosphere, higher than any object made by human hands would travel until the V-2 rocket a quarter of a century later. Each shot arced through the near vacuum for about 180 seconds before falling on Paris from more than 70 miles away, far enough that the gunners had to correct for the rotation of the Earth itself. The first shell struck the city at 18 minutes past 7 on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1918. Over the months that followed, the guns fired something over 300 rounds and killed around 250 people while wounding some 600. The worst single shot came on the 29th of March, when a shell collapsed the Church of Saint Gervais during a Good Friday service and killed 91 people at prayer. In military terms, the gun changed nothing. It was pure terror, engineered, and its actual product was not destruction, but fear delivered from beyond the horizon, which is a thing some buyers will always pay for. The logistics behind these weapons are part of the story, because they show a firm operating at a scale no competitor could match. Big Bertha did not simply arrive at a fort and fire. Each howitzer had to be broken down and hauled in pieces, moved by road or rail, and reassembled near the target by a large crew before the first shell could be loaded, a process of hours built around a weapon that then fired only about 8 rounds an hour. It was a siege instrument in the oldest sense, slow, ponderous, and devastating when it finally spoke. And against the Belgian forts in August of 1914, it did exactly what it was designed to do, cracking a ring of modern fortresses that were supposed to hold for months in a matter of days. The Paris gun was a different kind of achievement altogether, less a weapon than a proof of physics, and it needed a crew drawn from the Navy to manage a barrel that wore measurably with every shot, each successive shell slightly larger to compensate for the widening bore. Behind both sat the sheer industrial mass of the firm. Krupp was not only casting guns. Through the Germania-Werft yard, it was building the U-boats that nearly strangled British shipping, and across its works it was pouring the shells, the armor, and the artillery that kept the German army supplied through 4 years of attrition. The company had become, in effect, a second government, one whose product was the capacity to keep fighting, and the Reich leaned on it accordingly. Every gain in output, though, deepened the same exposure Alfred had created decades earlier. The firm had bet its entire scale on the war continuing, and it had financed that scale on the assumption of victory. When the assumption failed, the exposure did not soften. It became the bill. By 1918, the firm that had employed 81,000 people in 1914 employed close to 170,000. It had become the largest single engine of German war production, and when Germany lost, that engine turned overnight from a national asset into the thing the victors most wanted, switched off. But before the reckoning at Versailles came due, there surfaced an accounting error so strange it reads like fiction, and every part of it was real. Chapter 8. A royalty on every shell. Before the war, in an industry where the great arms makers of rival nations knew one another well and did business across borders as a matter of course, Krupp and the British firm Vickers had been partners of a kind. Krupp held patents on an artillery shell fuse, the small, precise mechanism that makes a shell detonate at the correct instant. And around 1902, Vickers licensed those German patents in order to make fuses of its own, agreeing to pay Krupp a royalty on every one. According to the most detailed study of the arrangement, the royalty ran to about 1 shilling and 2 pence per fuse, and the license bound Vickers to keep paying it for years to come. Then the war came, and Vickers went on manufacturing those fuses by the millions for the British Army. One design alone, fuse number 80, was produced to the tune of some 14 million units between 1914 and 1918, and the British government paid Vickers on the order of £10 million for them. Sit with what that arrangement actually meant. British shells were falling on German soldiers along the Western Front, and a great many of those shells carried a fuse built under a German patent on which a royalty was, in principle, owed to a company in Essen. Germany stood to be paid a small sum for each British shell that came down on German trenches, and the party that owed the payment was Britain's own leading arms manufacturer. The claim did not evaporate when the guns fell silent. It went before a body called the Anglo-German Mixed Arbitral Tribunal, established precisely to untangle these cross-border debts, and Krupp pressed it. On the 1st of September, 1926, the matter was settled, and Vickers paid Krupp £40,000. This is the idea from the Meppen Proving Ground, made literal and stamped in brass. Alfred Krupp had built a company that sold to every side because fear keeps faith with no border. His grandson's firm discovered that a patent keeps faith with no border either, and that a design licensed to a rival in peacetime does not stop earning the day that rival turns its guns on the licensor. The reservation should be stated plainly, since the whole episode rests largely on a single detailed account rather than a shelf of them, but the shape of it is not seriously questioned. A German firm collected money, after the war, on the fuses of the shells that had been fired at Germany. There is a detail in the fuse affair that sharpens the point to a needle. During the war itself, according to the same detailed account, Vickers appears to have stopped depositing the royalties it owed with the official custodian who held enemy property, while continuing to bill its own government for the fuses in full, so that by 1916 a substantial sum had gone uncollected on both ends of a debt that crossed the front line. The obligation did not disappear. It simply waited, as debts do, for the war to end and the accountants to arrive. When they did, the sums involved were not trivial. Krupp pursued a claim running into the hundreds of thousands of pounds before the tribunal. And though the final settlement of £40,000 in 1926 was a fraction of that, the principle it confirmed was the striking thing: that a commercial contract signed between rivals in peacetime had survived a world war fought between their nations and had been enforced afterward by an international court. Arms makers, it turned out, were bound to one another by paper in ways that armies fighting to the death were not. That is the reframe. The soldiers in the trenches were enemies. The firms that armed them were, at the level of the contract, still partners, and the paper outlasted the killing. The reckoning that followed was far less profitable. Even after the armistice, into the middle of 1919, Krupp was still at work on artillery, repairing some 238 guns and building 315 new ones before the door finally came down. It came down at Versailles. The treaty, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, stripped Germany of the weapons Krupp existed to make, banning military aircraft and tanks, forbidding submarines, capping what artillery could be built and where, and outlawing arms exports. On the 29th of May, 1920, an Allied Control Commission arrived at the Essen Works to enforce it in person, to inventory the machines and watch them destroyed. The arsenal of the Reich was ordered to disarm itself, under supervision, on its own factory floor. Gustav Krupp complied in public and evaded in private, and he did both at the same time. In public, the works turned to whatever peacetime goods it could sell: locomotives and trucks and agricultural machinery and excavators, and in 1926 it launched a genuinely successful civilian product, a tungsten carbide cutting material called Whittia, hard enough to machine almost anything and profitable for decades. Accounts drawn from the firm's biographers add cash registers and even stainless steel dental fittings to the list of things the great armory was reduced to producing, details that trace to those histories rather than to the company's own records. In private, the weapons work never actually stopped. It moved. In July of 1922, Krupp's shipyard helped establish a front company in the Netherlands to keep designing the submarines the treaty forbade. In Sweden, Krupp took a controlling interest in the arms maker Bofors and sent German engineers there to continue developing artillery well beyond the reach of the Allied inspectors. The guns were not gone. They were in Holland and Sweden, on drawing boards and proving grounds, kept alive and waiting for the day Germany decided it wanted them again. That day arrived in 1933, and the man who brought it made Gustav Krupp an offer the cautious old diplomat had spent his whole career being too careful to accept. Chapter 9. The 20th of February. Gustav Krupp did not begin as a believer in Adolf Hitler. He was a monarchist and a conservative by instinct, a man of the old establishment who found the Nazi movement crude and its leader an unknown and probably dangerous quantity. That reservation lasted right up until the moment it stopped being profitable. Hitler became chancellor on the 30th of January, 1933, and within weeks, Gustav's caution had converted into active support. The conversion had a date, an address, and a bill. On the 20th of February, 1933, about 25 of Germany's leading industrialists were summoned to the official residence of Hermann Göring in Berlin. The men in that room represented the commanding heights of the German economy: the chemicals giant IG Farben, the car maker Opel, the electrical firm Siemens, the insurer Allianz, and Krupp. Hitler spoke to them, and Göring spoke, and the message was direct: that the election 3 weeks away would decide the future of private enterprise in Germany, and that private enterprise ought to pay to see it decided correctly. When the speeches were finished, it was Gustav Krupp who stood to give the closing thanks on behalf of the assembled businessmen. Hjalmar Schacht, managing the collection, asked the room for 3 million marks. The pledges came to just over 2 million, paid into a fund with a deliberately bland name, the National Trust. That money financed the Nazi campaign for the election of the 5th of March, 1933. The election meant to deliver the 2/3 majority in the Reichstag that would pass the Enabling Act and dismantle German democracy by law 3 weeks after that. The industrialists in Göring's residence were not spectators to what followed. They had bought a ticket to it, and Gustav Krupp had stood up to give the thanks. Gustav then went further than most of his peers. That summer, a permanent donation machine was established, the Adolf Hitler Fund of German business, and Gustav, as chairman of the National Federation of Industry, helped inspire it and administer it. Over the next 12 years, that apparatus channeled an estimated 700 million marks to the Nazi Party, and what had begun as voluntary giving hardened, in practice, into a tax that German industry paid to the regime for the privilege of operating. In return, industry received what the regime was preparing to spend enormous sums on, and no firm on earth was better placed to receive an armaments boom than Krupp. It is worth being precise about what Gustav's conversion was and what it was not, because the temptation is to read it as a man swept up in a movement, and it was nothing so passive. Gustav Krupp was a careful, conservative administrator who had spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, and his shift after January of 1933 was a calculated judgment that the regime now holding power would be the largest customer his firm had ever had. The meeting at Göring's residence on the 20th of February was, for the men in the room, a straightforward transaction. They were asked to fund the campaign that would secure the regime, and in return they expected the regime to secure them, through orders, through the suppression of the labor movements they feared, through a state that would spend without limit on precisely the goods they made. Gustav standing to give the closing thanks was not a ceremonial gesture. It was the head of German industry publicly accepting the terms of the deal. And the deal delivered. As rearmament accelerated, Krupp moved back into the businesses Versailles had forbidden, developing tank designs and armor and artillery, some of it maturing from the work quietly kept alive in Sweden and the Netherlands through the lean years. The firm that had been reduced to locomotives and cutting tools a decade earlier was once again the arsenal of a German state preparing for war, and this time the state's appetite had no ceiling at all. The bet Gustav placed was the same bet in kind that Alfred had placed when he first sold cannon to Prussia, that the firm should ride the ambitions of the German government wherever they led. The difference was entirely in where they now led. Alfred's Prussia had wanted to win wars. Hitler's Reich wanted something else, and Krupp had just agreed to build the means for it. The boom was rearmament, and its scale is best read in the company's own figures. On the 16th of March, 1935, Hitler openly renounced the disarmament clauses of Versailles, and the weapons work Krupp had kept alive in Sweden and Holland and in locked drawers came back into daylight all at once. Krupp's workforce grew from 35,000 in 1932 to 112,000 by 1939. Its steel output climbed from around 1.5 million tons to roughly 4 million between 1932 and 1938. By 1942, the company was producing at about 5.5 times its 1932 level, and it controlled some 175 subsidiaries inside Germany and around 60 more abroad. Gustav Krupp had placed a bet, the same species of bet the family had been placing since 1811, that the firm's fortunes should be lashed to the ambitions of the German state. What had changed was the state. This time it was the Third Reich, and the Reich had already come to Krupp's engineers with a specific and enormous request. It wanted a gun large enough to shatter the strongest fortifications ever built. The answer Krupp gave was yes. The answer was a mistake, and it would take the shape of the largest gun the world has ever seen. Chapter 10. The Impossible Gun. In 1934, the German Army High Command handed Krupp a problem. France had built the Maginot Line, a chain of fortresses along its border packed with more concrete and armor than any gun had ever been designed to defeat, and the army wanted a weapon that could defeat it regardless. The problem landed on the desk of Krupp's chief artillery engineer, Erich Müller, a man known around the works as Gun Müller. Müller ran the calculation and arrived at a figure that should have closed the project on the spot. To do what the army was asking, to reliably crack the roof of a modern fort, the gun would need a caliber of 800 millimeters, 31.5 inches, a barrel a grown man could climb inside and stand up in. They built it anyway. In March of 1936, Hitler came to Essen and asked in person whether the thing was actually feasible, and the work went forward with his interest behind it. The finished weapon was named Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav, after Gustav Krupp himself, and a second gun of the same design was named Dora. The numbers it produced are almost useless as ordinary description because they break the scale that description relies on. It was the largest caliber rifled weapon ever used in combat. At roughly 1,350 tons, it was the heaviest mobile artillery piece ever built by anyone. It fired two kinds of shell, a concrete piercing round weighing 7,100 kilograms and a high explosive round of 4,800, out to ranges of about 38 and 48 kilometers. It could not sit on ordinary ground or roll on ordinary track. It rode on 8 bogies spread across 2 parallel railway lines laid side by side, because the load had to be split between 2 tracks to keep it from crushing a single one into the earth. Assembling it at a firing position took a crew of around 250 men, and feeding it, guarding it, and defending it against aircraft required a supporting force running into the thousands, with some accounts putting the total near 2,500 men and the preparation of a firing site at several weeks of labor. One gun. Around 7 million Reichsmarks. A small army required simply to make it shoot. And it never fired a shot at the thing it was built to destroy. The Maginot Line was the entire reason for its existence. And the Maginot Line never had to be broken, because in 1940 the German army drove around it, through the forests of the Ardennes, and rendered the fortresses militarily pointless. The most expensive gun in history was obsolete before it ever saw action, defeated not by a better weapon but by a map and a flanking march. When Schwerer Gustav finally went to war, it went east, to the siege of Sevastopol in June of 1942, and there, in the only major combat action of its entire existence, it fired 48 shells. 48. It threw a handful of them at coastal batteries and at forts the defenders had nicknamed Stalin and Molotov, and it fired 9 rounds at an undersea ammunition magazine buried beneath a bay under some 30 meters of water and 10 more of concrete, and it wrecked the magazine. The granular record of those days makes the futility concrete. The gun opened fire on the 5th of June, 1942, throwing its first shells at coastal batteries and at a fortified position the defenders called Fort Stalin. The next day it turned on another called Fort Molotov, and then on the target that has kept its name, the White Cliff, an ammunition magazine dug into the rock beneath the waters of Severnaya Bay, protected by some 30 meters of water and 10 of concrete, a target chosen precisely because nothing smaller could reach it. 9 of the great shells came down on it and destroyed it. In the middle of the month, the gun fired again at a fort named for Maxim Gorky, and that was very nearly the sum of it, a few dozen rounds across a fortnight, after which the barrel was worn and the siege ground on toward its conclusion by every ordinary means. Its sister gun, Dora, was positioned elsewhere on the Eastern Front and saw even less use, contributing essentially nothing before it too was withdrawn. Each of these weapons had traveled to the front as a train of its own, a convoy of specialized cars carrying the disassembled gun, its crew, its cranes, and its security, laid onto track built specifically to receive it. The entire apparatus existed to deliver, at colossal expense, a capability that the war almost never actually needed, because the one target in the whole conflict genuinely suited to it, the Maginot Line, had been made irrelevant 2 years before the gun was ready to fire a shot in anger. Then Sevastopol fell, the way such places usually fall, to infantry and ordinary artillery and the grinding arithmetic of a siege, none of which required a 1,300-ton cannon at all. The engineering deserves a moment of genuine respect before the verdict, because the verdict is harsh and it should be earned. To build a rifled gun of 800 millimeters that could actually fire, repeatedly, without tearing itself apart, and to make the whole 1,300-ton assembly mobile at all, even at the pace of a slow train on a purpose-laid double track, was a feat of metallurgy and mechanical design that no other firm on Earth could have attempted, let alone completed. This was the direct inheritance of everything the company had learned since Alfred first poured a flawless ingot in a London exhibition hall. The deepest expertise in large-scale steel anywhere in the world, focused to a single monstrous point. And that is exactly what makes it the perfect emblem of the firm's central flaw. All of that capability, the accumulated genius of a century, was poured into an object with almost no military value. The economics are damning when laid out plainly. A single gun cost on the order of 7 million Reichsmarks and tied up thousands of soldiers who could have been fighting, to deliver a rate of fire measured in a handful of shells per day, against targets that ordinary artillery and infantry took anyway. Every hour those men spent assembling and guarding and feeding Schwerer Gustav was an hour not spent on weapons that actually decided battles. The tanks and the field guns and the aircraft the same factories could have built, with the same steel and the same labor. In the language of a balance sheet, it was capital and manpower committed to an asset with a near-zero return, chosen not because the numbers justified it, but because a dictator was fascinated by size, and a firm was willing to indulge him. The gun was a triumph of engineering and a catastrophe of judgment. And the two facts do not cancel, they compound. That was the whole career. A weapon that consumed the better part of a decade and the labor of thousands to design, build, transport, and fire, and its total contribution to the war was 48 shells at a single siege that would have ended the same way without it. Its barrel wore out after a few hundred rounds. Near the end of the war, in April of 1945, German forces blew Schwerer Gustav up near Chemnitz to keep it out of Soviet hands, and days later American troops came upon the wreckage. It was scrapped for metal. No complete example of the largest gun ever built survives anywhere on Earth, and the largest gun ever built altered the outcome of precisely nothing. In the coldest terms a business can be judged by, it was a catastrophe of capital allocation. The firm's genuine engineering genius poured into an asset that could never, under any circumstances, earn back what it cost. And it was not even the worst decision the company made in those years. To build the guns and the tanks and the shells at the scale the Reich now demanded, Krupp needed labor it did not have and could not hire. It found the labor anyway. How it found the labor is the part of this story that no balance sheet is built to hold. Chapter 11. The cost. The German war economy ran on labor it could not recruit, because the men who would ordinarily have done the work were at the front, and so the regime supplied its factories with people who were given no choice in the matter. Prisoners of war. Civilians deported from occupied countries. Inmates of concentration camps, rented out to industry by the SS. Across the war, the number of forced laborers who passed through Krupp's operations has been put at more than 100,000. On a single date at the start of 1943, the firm's own records showed roughly 25,000 prisoners of war and civilian forced laborers on its books at once. At some Krupp sites, forced labor was not a supplement to the workforce. It was the workforce, on the order of 40% at the German plants and, by some accounts, as much as 80% at particular facilities. One of those facilities carried a name this account has been carrying since a wedding in 1906 and a siege gun at Liège in 1914. It was called the Bertha-Werk, the Bertha Works, named, exactly like the great howitzer of the First World War, after Bertha Krupp. It stood in Silesia, and it was worked by Jewish and other slave laborers under conditions engineered to extract labor from people the regime had already classified as expendable. The woman whose name had been a tribute on the barrel of Big Bertha now had that same name over the gate of a factory staffed by the enslaved. The tribute and the atrocity share a name because they share a company, across a single lifetime. That is not a symmetry the telling arranges for effect. It is one the record itself supplies. The firm did not drift into this by inattention. According to the evidence assembled after the war, Krupp initiated the request for slave labor and signed detailed contracts with the SS, formally handing the discipline and punishment of its workers over to the men who ran the camps. In 1942, the company sited plant at Auschwitz to draw on the inmates there and built a fuse factory on the ground, the same category of small, precise device that had once earned it a royalty from Vickers, now assembled by prisoners a short walk from the gas chambers. The conditions at Krupp's labor camps were described afterward by survivors and by a camp doctor under oath. Overcrowding, a diet built around meat that had been rejected as unfit for other use, clothing inadequate for a Silesian winter, tuberculosis running at several times the normal rate, and beatings administered with rubber hoses and iron bars. Some accounts attach very high death tolls to Krupp's labor operations, and those figures are contested and probably fold in the broader mortality of the surrounding camp system, so the precise number who died is not settled and should not be stated as if it were. What is not contested, and does not depend on any disputed figure, is the arrangement itself. A private firm that requested human beings from the SS by written contract and worked them at plants bearing the family's own name. The business logic behind the crime is important to state precisely because it was a business decision before it was anything else. Germany's factories had lost their workers to the army, and output was the one thing the Reich demanded above all. The regime offered industry a solution, a supply of human beings who would not be paid, could not leave, and could be worked to the limit and beyond, rented from the SS by contract. For a firm whose founder had spent a fortune binding labor to the company through welfare, the temptation of labor that required no welfare at all, no housing worth the name, no pension, no wage, was a temptation the firm did not resist. The evidence assembled afterward indicates that Krupp did not merely accept workers assigned to it, but actively requested them, negotiated for them, and built facilities specifically to exploit the camp populations, including plants sited at Auschwitz to draw on the inmates there. The conditions followed from the logic. If labor costs nothing to acquire and nothing to replace, then there is no economic reason to keep a laborer alive, and the camps were run as though that were literally true. Survivors and a camp doctor described the results under oath: the starvation diet, the winter without clothing, the disease, the beatings. This is the endpoint of a 100-year argument about how a firm should hold its workers. Alfred Krupp had answered it with total control, dressed as care. His great-grandson's firm answered it with total control and nothing else, because a regime had removed every reason to pretend otherwise. The distance between the model employer of the 1870s and the slave plants of the 1940s is real, and it is horrifying. But the underlying philosophy, that the firm's need for labor outranks the humanity of the laborer, ran through both, and only the restraints had changed. This is the point at which the loyalty machine of 1872 completes its arc. Alfred Krupp had built a system of total control over labor, and had called it welfare. Housing and pensions and clinics offered in exchange for absolute devotion and the surrender of any right to organize or resist. Strip away the housing and the pensions, remove every soft wall, and push the underlying idea to its limit under a regime that recognized no restraint, and total control over labor becomes this. The care was never the point. The control was the point. And the control is what remained when everything gentle around it was taken away. While the plants ran on forced labor, the ownership of the firm itself was being locked down for the future by the regime it served. In March of 1943, Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the eldest son of Gustav and Bertha, took over the chairmanship from his failing father. Alfred was not a reluctant heir dragged along by events. He had been a supporting member of the SS since 1931 and a member of the Nazi Party since 1938. On the 12th of November, 1943, Hitler signed a decree written for this single company, the Lex Krupp, the Krupp Law. It dissolved the firm's joint stock structure and converted it into a personally owned family enterprise with special rules of succession, engineered so that the entire empire would pass intact to one heir rather than being divided among many. It took effect that December, and ownership passed wholly to Alfred as sole proprietor. A dictator rewrote German corporate law for the benefit of a single family, to keep the arsenal of the Reich dynastic and whole. The decree did precisely what it was built to do. It gathered the whole of Krupp into one man's hands. And in gathering the ownership, it also gathered the responsibility. Because when the war ended and someone had to answer for the plants and the contracts and the camps, the law had already written the name down. The man the Lex Krupp had made sole owner of everything was about to become sole owner of the reckoning as well. Chapter 12. 3 years. When the Allies assembled the first great war crimes trial at Nuremberg in 1945, they wanted a Krupp in the dock, and they named one. It was Gustav. He was listed among the 24 defendants indicted before the International Military Tribunal in October of 1945. But Gustav Krupp was 75 years old and had been left senile and incapable by a stroke, unable to follow the proceedings or assist in his own defense, and the tribunal ruled that he could not be tried. The prosecution asked to substitute his son Alfred in his place, to keep a Krupp in the principal trial. The tribunal refused the late exchange. Gustav was never tried at all. He died in 1950 a free man, having led the firm through the entire Nazi period, and he faced no verdict for any of it. Alfred faced his own. In December of 1947, the Americans opened a separate proceeding against German industrialists, and Alfred Krupp and 11 of his directors stood as the defendants in what became known as the Krupp trial. The charges were two: the plunder of property across occupied Europe and the use of slave labor. On the 31st of July, 1948, the verdicts were delivered. 11 of the 12 men were convicted. Alfred was sentenced to 12 years in prison and, alone among all the defendants, to the forfeiture of his entire fortune, the whole of the empire that the Lex Krupp had concentrated in him 5 years earlier. Hitler's decree had made him sole owner so that the company would remain whole. The court used that same undivided ownership to take the whole of it away in a single sentence. For one strange moment, the man who owned everything owned nothing. The trial itself is worth seeing in a little more detail, because of who sat in the dock and who did not. The case against the Krupp directors, heard through 1947 and into 1948, was not built on the giant gun or on any single famous weapon. It was built on two categories of conduct that the prosecution documented at length: the systematic plunder of factories and property across the occupied countries, and the use of slave labor on a scale the evidence made impossible to deny. 11 of the 12 defendants were convicted on the 31st of July, 1948, with sentences ranging from a few years to 12, and only one man was acquitted outright. Alfred alone drew the full penalty of imprisonment and total forfeiture, because he alone had been made, by Hitler's decree, the sole owner of everything the charges concerned. And the absence at the center of it all was Gustav, the man who had actually led the firm through the entire Nazi period, who had stood in Göring's residence in 1933 and administered the donation fund and presided over the rearmament. Gustav was never tried, because a stroke had left him incapable, and the tribunal would not substitute his son into the first great trial to keep a Krupp in the dock. So the man most responsible faced no verdict at all and died free in 1950, while his son carried the legal weight of the family's conduct and then, within 3 years, was relieved of most of it. The reckoning, when the accounting is done, fell on one generation for the decisions of another, and even on that one it did not fall for long. The moment lasted about 3 years. In the early post-war years, the United States recalculated its priorities, as the deepening Cold War made a strong, productive West Germany far more valuable than a thoroughly punished one, and the man who held the authority to revisit the sentences handed down at Landsberg was the American High Commissioner, John J. McCloy. On the 31st of January, 1951, McCloy granted clemency. He commuted Alfred's sentence, and he ordered the restoration of the property the court had confiscated. Alfred walked out of Landsberg prison a free man, roughly 3 years into a 12-year term, and he walked out with his empire legally handed back to him. Convicted of slave labor and stripped of everything in 1948, free and re-enriched by 1951. The sentence had read 12 years and total forfeiture. The reality came to 3 years and a refund. Then he rebuilt. In 1953, the Mehlem Agreement returned his assets on the condition that he sell off his coal and steel holdings, a condition that was, in the event, largely never enforced, and Alfred spent the 1950s and early 1960s rebuilding Krupp into one of the largest industrial concerns in Europe on the back of the West German economic miracle. By the middle of the 1960s, the company again employed around 100,000 people and turned over more than $1 billion a year. As for the people who had been worked at the Bertha works and the fuse plants, in 1959, Krupp agreed to compensate Jewish former forced laborers, establishing a fund of 6 million marks, potentially rising to 10, which worked out to roughly 5,000 marks for each eligible person. The fund was capped, and the money ran out, and many who had a legitimate claim, including most of the non-Jewish laborers, received nothing from it at all. The plunder had taken years and spanned a continent. The restitution was a capped fund and a partial list, and then it was closed. The clemency was not a quiet legal footnote. It was controversial at the time, and has remained so, because of what it appeared to say about the relationship between justice and usefulness. Alfred had been convicted, in a court of the victorious powers, of using slave labor and plundering occupied countries, and the sentence had been the most severe handed to any of the industrialists: 12 years and the loss of everything. 3 years later, a single American official reversed the financial heart of that sentence and handed a convicted man back one of the largest fortunes in Europe, at the precise moment when West German industrial strength had become a Cold War asset the United States wanted on its side. Critics saw the logic plainly: that a rich and productive Germany was now worth more to the West than a punished one, and that Alfred Krupp was released not because the crime had shrunk, but because the calculus around it had changed. Whatever the intent, the effect was unambiguous. The man walked out of Landsberg into a country rebuilding at extraordinary speed, took back a company positioned to lead that rebuilding, and within little more than a decade was again running one of the largest firms in Europe. The Mechelen Agreement of 1953 had formally required him to break up his coal and steel empire as a condition of restoration, a condition that in practice was allowed to lapse, so that the divestiture meant to limit his power quietly never happened. By the mid-1960s, Krupp employed around 100,000 people once more and turned over more than $1 billion a year. Set against that recovery, the compensation offered to the people who had actually paid the cost was a rounding error, a fund of a few million marks, capped, distributed to a limited category of survivors, and exhausted while thousands of valid claimants received nothing. The asymmetry is the whole point, and it needs no adjective. The empire was restored in full. The restitution was partial, capped, and closed. Alfred had his company back, his fortune back, and his freedom. What he did not have, and could not manufacture, was a successor who wanted any of it. Chapter 13. The Last Krupp. Alfred Krupp had one son, born in 1938, named Arndt von Bohlen und Halbach. He was raised as the heir to the largest industrial fortune in Europe, the fifth generation of a family that had made its name by never once letting the company leave its hands. And he did not want it. Arndt was a man of a different century than his forefathers, elegant, social, drawn to the pleasures of a jet-set life and not at all to the discipline of running a steel empire, and in 1966 he formally renounced his right to inherit the firm and to run it. In exchange, he was to receive an allowance, reported at around 2 million marks a year for the rest of his life. The dynasty that had survived bankruptcy, 2 world wars, a war crimes conviction, and the forfeiture and restoration of its entire fortune was ended not by any of those things, but by an heir who preferred to be paid to walk away. His timing was pointed, because the company he declined was in trouble. Through 1966 and into 1967, Krupp hit a liquidity crisis, and the firm that had once been able to command loans from the Prussian State Bank now had to go looking for credit from a syndicate of banks, seeking fresh money after tens of millions in earlier advances, and accepting in return an outside supervisory council imposed on the family business, the very thing Alfred Krupp had spent his life keeping out. The old lesson from the panic of 1873 had come around one final time. Scale is a bet financed with debt, and debt is a character that never leaves the room. And in the end, it was still in the room. On the 30th of July, 1967, Alfred Krupp died of heart failure at the age of 59, the last Krupp to personally own the company that bore the name. What followed had been made possible by Arndt's renunciation, and it ended the family's ownership for good. Under Alfred's will and the arrangements around it, the firm was converted into a joint stock corporation, Friedrich Krupp G. Meters BH, and its shares were placed entirely in the hands of a new body, the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, inaugurated on the 1st of January, 1968. After roughly 156 years, counting from Friedrich's cast steel gamble of 1811, the Krupp Company was no longer owned by a Krupp. It was owned by a charitable foundation carrying the family's name. And that could only happen because the last heir had signed his birthright away for an annuity. Arndt lived out his years as a titled playboy, and he died in 1986 at the age of 48, without children. The direct line simply stopped. The company itself did not stop. In 1999, Krupp merged with its old rival Thyssen to form ThyssenKrupp, headquartered, still, in Essen, on the ground where Friedrich had built his failing furnaces. The Alfred Krupp Foundation remained the largest single shareholder, holding a stake of just under 21%. And it remains so. What the company makes now would be unrecognizable to the Cannon King and, for a long time, would have surprised almost anyone. For decades, one of its largest and most profitable businesses was elevators, the machinery of moving people gently upward, until the firm sold that division in 2020 for something on the order of 17 billion euros. Today, the group employs around 93,000 people across dozens of countries and makes steel, industrial components, and green hydrogen technology. And through its Marine Systems division, it still builds warships and submarines for the German Navy and for foreign buyers, which means that the one thread running unbroken from Alfred Krupp's first steel cannon in 1847 to the present day is the building of weapons for whoever will buy them. Some things about the firm changed completely. That one never did. There is a bleak symmetry in how the family ended, and it is worth drawing out because it closes a theme the story opened with. The Krupp dynasty had been built and preserved, generation after generation, by an absolute refusal to let the company pass out of family hands or be divided among heirs. Friedrich had bet the fortune rather than sell out. Alfred had inherited a ruin at 14 rather than let it die. The Kaiser had arranged a marriage rather than let a woman's ownership loosen the state's grip. Hitler had written a bespoke law rather than let the empire fragment on Gustav's decline. 5 generations had treated undivided family ownership as the one non-negotiable principle. And then the last heir simply did not want it, and no law, no marriage, and no decree could manufacture desire in a man who lacked it. Arndt's renunciation in 1966 was, in its quiet way, the most decisive act in the family's later history, because it was the one thing none of his ancestors had been willing to contemplate. It also arrived at the worst possible moment, as the firm hit a liquidity crisis and had to submit, for the first time, to an outside supervisory council imposed by a syndicate of dozens of banks, the exact loss of independent family control that Alfred had structured his entire life to prevent. When Alfred died in 1967, the machinery to end the dynasty was already in motion, and his will completed it, folding the whole company into a foundation. The conversion could only happen because Arndt had already stepped aside, and so the family's 400-year run through the town of Essen ended not with a bankruptcy or a bombing or a trial, all of which it had survived, but with an heir choosing an allowance over an empire. Arndt lived out his time as a titled figure of the social pages and died in 1986, childless, at 48. There was no next Krupp, because the last one had declined the part. The house on the hill changed too. Villa Hügel, Alfred Krupp's 269-room fortress against fire and drafts and the outside world, is today a public museum and concert venue, run by the foundation, its doors open to anyone who buys a ticket. The most private house in German industry became a place the public strolls through on a Sunday. The foundation that owns the company spends its share of the profits on science, on education, on medicine, on music, and the fine arts. The fortune built on canon now funds string quartets. That is the shape the story finally takes, and it is worth stopping, at the end, to name exactly what that shape means. Conclusion. The name on the steel. Here is the whole of it, compressed into a single cold inventory. A merchant family, 4 centuries in one town. A cast steel gamble that killed the man who made it and left a 14-year-old a debt with a furnace attached. A seamless railway wheel that built a fortune. And a steel cannon the army did not want for 12 years. Guns sold to 46 nations, more than half of every barrel going abroad. A siege howitzer named for the owner's daughter, and a slave labor plant named for her too. A gun the size of a building that fired 48 shells and changed nothing. 100,000 forced laborers. A law written by a dictator to keep one family's company whole, and a court that used that same law to take it away, and a refund handed back 3 years later. A dynasty ended by an heir who preferred an allowance. A charitable foundation, funding the arts, on the profits of all of it. The thesis of this channel is that companies do not make decisions, people do, and that the interesting story is never the product, but the gap between the company and the name it leaves behind. With Krupp, that gap is enormous, and it is where the entire business story lives. Consider the decisions as pure business, stripped of everything else. Friedrich attacked a monopoly and priced the attack wrong, and it killed him. Alfred narrowed a failing firm to what it could actually make, protected a secret as if it were the only asset, because it was, and advertised a capability years before he could sell the product, until a hostile market had no choice but to buy. He built a welfare system to lock in the labor a secret depends on, and it worked for 2 generations. He sold to all sides because fear is not loyal to a border, and his firm learned, at Versailles, that a patent is not loyal to one either. Consider the errors the same way, as decisions made once and paid for later. Fritz built a company that could pass only through a single heir, and it passed to a 16-year-old, and then to a diplomat renamed by a Kaiser. Gustav tied the firm to the ambitions of the German state one time too many, and the state that time was the Third Reich. The company poured its genius into the largest gun ever built, an asset that could never earn its cost, and it staffed its factories with the enslaved, a decision that no clemency and no capped fund ever came close to settling. Every one of those choices had a cost, and the ledger the narrator promised at the start is now closed. Some of the costs were paid in marks. The largest of them were not paid by Krupp at all. And yet the name survived every bit of it, because the name meant something precise, and precision is the one thing the market never stops paying for. Krupp meant steel that did not fail, whether it was wrapped around a train wheel, a warship, or a shell, and a name that means, do not worry, this will not fail, outlasts the men who earned it and the crimes they committed under it. It is stamped on submarines today. The 3 rings, the 3 seamless railway tires from 1875, are still there. If you want to understand how a brand can outlive the company that built it, the family that owned it, and very nearly the moral reckoning that should have buried it, Krupp is the case to study.